So, hi everyone, welcome to Think Up. And for those of you who've never heard of Think Up before, Think Up is a movement or a project or an ambition that I created, or it morphed from what was an expansion platform of thinking. And Think Up is kind of a themology that is based on an attempt by myself and others, and the interesting people on this call included and primary, in enabling discussions to trigger new ways of thinking and maintain the sovereignty of our intellect in a world where we're increasingly outsourcing everything from decisions that doctors make to thought patterns that we revolve around the whole time. I mean, our brain has between 60, 70, 80,000 thoughts per day, of which 90% of them are the same. And so we tend to run in these cyclical patterns. And the conversation we're going to have today is very much linked to that, because there's this, the concept I call thought court, something which I was first considering when I studied social biology in 1989. It was the precursor to what then later became more commonly known as behavioral economics, and is now within neuroeconomics, which is a multidisciplinary field seeking to explain human decision making, the ability to process multiple alternatives and to follow a course of action. Neuroeconomics studies the economic behavior, how that can shape our understanding of the brain, and how neuroscientific discoveries can constrain and guide models of economics. And a thought court in my head, anyway, is that when a stimulus happens, it can be an experience, it could be a piece of information, it could be an event, whatever type of experience happens. The way I view the way that we think is that there is and this is now metaphorical rather than scientific. So my view is a metaphor. I think that there is a prosecution attorney and a defense attorney, and we are in part judge and jury. And what we do is we witnesses these two opposing sides arguing how we should think about said stimulus, and therefore how we should act, because our behavior is a direct result of our thoughts, and our thoughts are a direct result of our experiences. So the way that I think defense attorneys and prosecutions attorneys work in our thinking is that one of them adopts a side and the other one is the contrarian. It doesn't matter actually who is who, but what I do feel is that one of them contains their armory of biases and heuristics. Biases are fairly self-explanatory, but heuristics are methods of thinking, like frameworks of thought. So our heuristics and biases are what's inside the briefcase of either the prosecution or the defense attorney, depending on what suits them best on that particular moment of your 60 to 80,000 thoughts per day stimulus. So an example would be, for instance, a defense attorney being someone who is defending a status quo bias. Say something new comes along and someone says, "Hey, have you ever checked out this thriller on Netflix?" And the defense attorney says, so it walks into the thought court, and the defense attorney says, "We don't like thrillers. We like comedies. Thrillers scare us. We were scared as a child because of Stephen King's It. That means we're not only scared of thrillers, we're also scared of clowns. And so if you're telling me, do I want to watch something about clowns on Netflix? My answer is no." Now, that's a massive stretch, and it's nothing to do with clowns, and clowns were never mentioned. Also, the thriller could be a comic thriller, but nonetheless, the bias is straight in there from the defense attorney defending the status quo. The prosecution attorney says, "You always say that. That's the reason why you never actually progress and learn and experience new things." And the defense attorney says, "But I'm totally comfortable with where I am." And the prosecution says, "But you know that girl that you were trying to get together with, and you know she was into thrillers. If you watch this thriller, then you have a different conversation the next time that you can actually speak to her." And the defense attorney says, "To be honest with you, if she's going to make a decision about me being valid enough to be in her life based on what I want to watch on Netflix, then she's not going to be worthy anyway." This goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and it lasts for 0.01 of a second in real time. And then the outcome is, I'm not going to watch the thriller. Or the outcome is, I'm going to try and watch the thriller. And so that's thought court. kind of fictitious example. By the way, if you're seeing this white thing going past it's actually a kitchen roll on the top. This is a makeshift plaster.
Right.
Right. I was trying to open a tin can with a thing opener, lacerated my thumb. But I've also now realised that I am going to dedicate a significant amount of time to wiping out all usage of tin cans that need opening, and I'm also going to fix can openers because they suck. So anyway, that's, again, okay, looking at that through the thought court, this happens, stimulus happens. My prosecution attorney in this case was prosecution of the entire concept of tin cans and can opener. The defense attorney says, John, you've got enough stuff on your plate, man. You've got enough stuff on your plate. Why do you need to chase after tin cans? Why don't you just be more careful or learn to use a can opener more effectively? You know, you don't need to do all these kind of things. And the outcome at the moment in my thought court is that I'm going after the tin cans. So, welcome everyone to this conversation about thought court. This is Martin and this is Prashant, and I'm glad that you guys can join. And for those watching as well, you should know that these two guys have been the supporters of this platform since way before it was called this, and they are not only admins of the Think Up Facebook group, but they are my counsel of reason, almost like a thought court. But neither of them is a prosecutor or defense attorney. In fact, one of them is a brilliant musician and also a corporate advisor on how to incorporate play into the workspace, and the other is a novelist. And one of the things that I like about Prashant is that one of his taglines used to be be careful what you say to me, or be careful what you do, or you might appear in my next novel, which I've always loved. I'm paraphrasing that. What was the actual quote?
Okay, well, you might end up in my novel or something.
Yes,
yeah.
You might end up in my novel. I love that. Good. Well, so Prashant, over to you to start with. When you saw this video clip of me talking about Thought Court originally, and you responded positively, you like to talk about it, what was your initial gut feeling about this topic?
I mean, it was pretty much about biases, basically. I mean, that was the first thought that came to my mind. And in my case, for example, I don't know if this would apply here, but a certain person that I know exhibits a certain type of snobbery. And I don't like her snobbery very much because it's affiliated to things I don't like. But then I realized I've got snobberies of my own, which are sort of, snobberies of the intellect or whatever. And I mean, am I justified in, not liking this person's snobbery? Or, you've gone mute.
It's all right. Do you feel in your thought court when you consider this person, can you see the two sides of the coin? One of being, well, this is actually a bit ironic because it's a bit hypocritical because you also have snobbery, and maybe the other attorney is saying, no, you're totally valid. Your snobbery is actually justified. Their snobbery is.
Yeah, I imagine that's happening in her mind as well. I mean,
I was going there next.
So I think it's a kind of. I think it's sort of because that person's snobbery revolves around things related to consumerism, which I find completely shallow. But then I realized that, I'm coming from a place of intellectual snobbery, which is another form of snobbery. It's probably no better. And it ultimately amounts to, looking down on people and thinking you're better than someone else for a particular reason. So yeah. That's a bit of a conflict when you think of it, when you dig deep into it.
Funny you should mention the word conflict, because in fact the nature of court is indeed conflicting. The purpose of the court is for the outcome of a conflict to be rationalized to justice. So from conflict we resolve into justice. But I think, in fact, what I'm fascinated by with the way that we think is that there is. I attest that there is constant conflict between biases and heuristics that are in place and more ratio that is built inside us that continually looks at the bias and heuristics, and or if we are aware of the bias and heuristics, which is the whole point of ThinkUp, and actually then the conflict can be balanced. Martin, what was your view when you first came across this presumption of mine?
To take on thought process and debate as well of the presentation of a thesis, then the antithesis, and finding a synthesis. And so in this way, we can always, I guess, we're all searching just for what is the truth about anything, and a lot of our thoughts are based on that. And it, whether it's true for us because it's something we feel inside rather than kind of a factual based demonstrable truth, or whatever it might be. So I kind of looked at this and thought it kind of fits into that. And then I got that thought in my head of used to seeing cartoons all the time of the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other side. So I started thinking about how does this work in terms of our brains being inherently lazy. So we usually link to the easiest way of doing things and how our sort of flight, fight, or freeze response really works as well. Taking that shortcut kind of route that our brain usually takes, is there a point where something steps in and just offers that contrary opinion within this thought core?
Yeah, well, and funny enough, I think it can do if we pay the attorney enough. And so extending the metaphor, to pay the attorney of interjection would be to assert a pause before we just rely on our reaction, which is a reenaction of the last time we did that thing. And if we can fuel that attorney to some extent after the pause to argue the absolute irrationality of that bias, then we have an option. We have the opportunity there for the synthesis or the output to be more reasoned, and that's where I think we have an opportunity. Prashant, what's your view?
So I have a question. In the case of zealots and ideologues or religious fundamentalists, don't they have this contrarian view popping up at any point? I mean, does that never happen? We as I see it, we occupy sort of moderate points in the scale, all of us. A sort of middle point where we are somewhat open to the contrarian point of view. But if you're completely wired to be a zealot or an ideologue or a religious fundamentalist or something, how does that sort of wiring work?
That's such a brilliantly loaded question, and I welcome that. So my personal view from a scientific perspective is that the bias, that neurons that fire together wire together, actually. And so if we fire neurons together in a way again and again and again and again and again, they actually become hardwired in ourselves. And that then forms a linkage that, and I'll give you an example. If for instance, there is a dogma involved, and we are absolutely convinced that by going to church on Sunday and praying will escape us going to hell, then that wiring pattern is exceptionally difficult to break apart, but more so, and to your point, even more strongly, the argumentation that person has to anyone who is contrarian to it. In other words, someone saying, but surely, and insert any form of undogmatic or more reasoned view. For instance, surely if your God really loved you, then you wouldn't need to actually sacrifice. You would, or surely if you, why do you need to go to church? You could just pray at home. Or surely, anything else like that. The answer to it is, the answer looks to the thought court, so that you position that contrarian view, goes to the dogmatic person's thought court, in their thought court, the prosecution is the only attorney in the court, because the defense attorney has been unfed and has been unwatered and unpaid. And so the defense attorney, even if the defense attorney does appear in the court, the defense attorney will not stand up and will not speak up. And the prosecution attorney just stands there and can argue it to the nth degree. And because the defense hasn't been fueled, there cannot be one. And even in fact saying to that person, do you realize there is another attorney in your court that could be paid? Paying that attorney is against what the structure of the court that the prosecution has run wild with. Yeah. And what I find fascinating is if you do it in reverse, someone who always believed that they had no God in them, or there was no God, and then they find some form of religion, and they become this giant, enthusiastic kind of promoter of it. What could well be the feeling of that is an awakening of an attorney, a fueling of an attorney, and this realization that actually there was always this other part. So, and I'm not saying I'm not being pro or against any form of dogma. What I would say, however, is that the people I respect with religious beliefs are those who have reasoned the religious beliefs by using both attorneys. And let's talk about on the snobbery point. I am really, really snobbish about finding rationale, ratio, reason. I am actually snobbish about it, because you know what, and I'll be blatant about it. The opposite is ignorance.
Yeah,
that's my view. Martin, what's your view on that?
Really, I sometimes do have a problem with dogmatic ideologies. Really, so the idea of following a dogma or an ideology, to me, it feels like that any doubt is just suppressed straight away. There's no room for doubt within that, and I think that's always acting out of fear. If you're not brave enough to confront your doubts, then your ideology is built on sand. It's a house of cards that can fall. So I tend to feel that that's more. It's an area that I think, as you were saying with your snobbishness, there is an absence of reason from that. That somebody who's built an ideology and will suppress any doubt at all costs, they've shoved reason to one side at that point.
Yeah. And what's worse is they actually say what they're doing is reasoned. They actually shove it to one side and call shoving it to one side reason. And that's where the danger really comes, because it becomes justified. It's like just the prosecution attorney in the court, no defense attorney present or no defense attorney visible. And then the justification of not having a defense attorney is because why do you need a defense attorney? That's actually what's reasonable is to just have a prosecution attorney. It's like, that's not reason. And it's like, well, it is reason because it's my court, and that's what. And it's like, oh, okay. Prashant, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I can tell you in my case how the snobbery sort of translates. In my mind, it goes like, oh, this person, well, she's into brand names and all that thing. She's part of this culture that's destroying the environment and destroying civic society, and whereas I'm following something much higher, something loftier, or and it sounds like a terribly pompous thing to say, but you have to admit when you're being pompous. But
I agree.
So I mean, yeah. So that's exactly how this conversation goes.
Yeah, and when you have, can you argue? Could you form an argument in your head that would justify her view being as valid as yours?
At this point, I've left it to personal experience. Well, it's yeah. I need to find some inner depth underneath all that, because I've yeah. I suppose I suppose I've never. It's a bit of a struggle. I'm trying. I'm keeping an open mind. I'm suppressing the intellectual snobbery. I'm trying my. What I'm doing is at the moment suppressing the intellectual snobbery of my own intellectual snobbery,
Yeah.
and trying to see something in that view.
Okay, there is an argument, of course, that there's a couple of different methods. One of which is to suppress the snobbery. The other is to enter a space of awareness and acceptance of all. And so I wonder about suppression in general being moving away from our most authentic self, regardless of whether it's snobbish or not snobbish or whatever. But I think suppression may be anti-authentic, and I'm thinking that awareness and acceptance could be pro-authentic, and actually pro-conscious.
Oh yeah, you're probably right. It's just that you know, I think it's. I think that it's a sort of a trigger reaction in me. What, you know, all the branding and the advertising and all the consumerism does to me. It's I live in the downtown core of Montreal, and every time I step out, there's always all sorts of promotions screaming at me in my face. People driving Ferraris in a really noisy sort of way, and all that sort of thing. And it's somehow kind of what do you call it? It kind of shakes my foundations a little bit, which makes me want to get away from all this and into a cafe as soon as possible with my book. And when I see a person actually kind of defending all this, so I think there's a bit of a trigger reaction in there.
Yeah, and your prosecution attorney seems to be well oiled in terms of the view on that, and I think there's maybe a defense attorney that is is trying hard to say that's one view of consumerism and branding and marketing and advertising, and the other view is that this is the type of blitzkrieg approach that will accelerate our desire to form a new level of consciousness, because the more and more crap that we're dealt, that immersion of shit could result in more people saying, actually, you know what, I don't want this. And so this is a little, the defense attorney voice saying that actually this is actually on aggregate over time, zoomed out, this is positive.
Yeah.
It's a tough argument, and I think the defense attorney doesn't have as many bullets in its ammunition than the prosecution. Even as I'm saying this, I feel I have a similar. I do kind of feel similarly, to such an extent that I won't write another business book after this next one.
Yeah.
I'm aiding the machine.
Yeah, I think yeah, it's a whole lot of I guess, yeah, I mean, you just run into someone who's the mouthpiece for all of this.
Yeah.
I mean, there's if you had to take this to a further level, suppose you ran into a neo-Nazi. Now, how would your prosecution and your defense attorney kind of assimilate all that? I mean,
should I tell you how? Actually, it's a great example. I would adopt what Viktor Frankl has based his life's work on following his Auschwitz experience. I would apply an acceptance and awareness of anyone else's scenario, and I would choose not to react against them, especially after the amount of abuse and stuff in my past. I would choose to respond positively and work out where there may be some form of commonalities. My reason stops when my family or loved ones are damaged.
Yeah.
And that's when I find it the hardest, because if said neo-Nazi attacked my son,
yeah,
it would be very, very hard for me to find reason behind that and acceptance. My initial response would be if I was unable to defend, my initial response would be to attack. But that's the exception rather than the rule, and it's not something I'm I'm proud of. But I think as parents, we are hardwired let's expand that. As humans, I believe we are hardwired to reproduce and to enable our genes to move forward into new millennia. So that's actually our Lord, if we look at it from that. And by the way, I should also say, if you replace the word God in any form of Bible with the word energy, it makes a shitload of sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Consciousness, energy. I mean, because the word God just anthropomorphizes something that's much bigger than all.
This is why one of the reasons why the Romans actually stripped apart the Greek gods, which were bigger. These giant kind of the Atlases and the Athenas and stuff like that, and said, no, we don't want these giant, great, big, superhuman gods. We're the gods. Here's capitalism. That's God. Right? It's a masterstroke. Martin, over to you. What's your views? What are you thinking?
Well, my views are, I don't really want to get too into a kind of theological discussion at all. Because I don't know, it's a rabbit hole that we could end up talking for 3 or 4 days on. But what I kind of would be interested in looking at is, how do you recognise within yourself that you're suppressing one area of this thought court argument?
Yeah, well, and I have a view, and then I'll hand over to you, Prashant. My view is that if we are able to accept that there is another view inside us, that there is another option, and it doesn't matter too much whether we know what that option is to start with, but just the acceptance. When I'm speaking to people who have certain challenges that are leading down a path of depression, one of the thought patterns that I use with people is an analogy between looking at the grey sky that seems to be perpetually in British culture, that the acceptance that there is actually blue sky beyond the clouds, that the sun actually always shines. It always shines. The fact that you can't see the sun shining is circumstantial, but the sun always does shine. The blue sky is always there, and it might be super, super, super difficult to see it, but it is always there. And the option, I think, accepting an option. I've just been through a relatively hard time in my life in certain contexts, and I've had to try really, really hard to accept that there is positivity at the end of this. There is learning. There's learning during this. There's things that I can take from it. However crap it is, there are ways. And just the acceptance of an option would be my starting point to your question. Prashant, what's your view?
Yes, acceptance is good, but I think there's at some point there's got to be an element of knowing, because I think you could go there, then you could just send yourself down the other extreme road of confusion and doubt, and you're being stretched in all different places and nothing's coming out of it. And that could lead to, it could be that, there's not just a prosecution and a defense, but there's judges and juries who are against each other. On top of, monkeys sitting on top of the ceiling and flinging poo at everyone. And, it could just be a whole internal mess. So maybe you also do need to have a point at which you need to know where to kind of reconcile the two, I think maybe it should be with a sense of purpose of finding some sort of harmony rather than simply just opening the way to.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think ideologically, ending from hypothesis, thesis to synthesis, I can see the ideological outcome being that. And my view is that chain of events starts with an acceptance that there is another. There is another view. So whatever you think, there is a counter argument that is equally as valid in its homeostatic state. It's equally valid.
Yeah.
If we were to accept that there is a contrarian view, and then those prosecution and defense attorneys of our thoughts can argue and then resolve, both of them with their hypotheses, to form some form of synthesis. That I think is the critical path to finding resolution in balance, which is the key word here, of our thoughts, so we can act reasonably with rationale rather than unreasonably, in an irrational way that causes not only harm to others but also harm to ourselves, because we're actually cheating ourselves from the opportunity of having greater thought processes.
Because I've got a friend who doubts his own doubts, and I feel that stops him from, that actually stops him from completely living a complete, he goes, has a thought, has a doubt, then doubts the doubt, goes further, and it leads down a rabbit hole of doubts.
Well, with not knowing your friend and not being a psychotherapist, that may well be, that may well show other mental frameworks than what we're talking about here. Let's say that the prosecution attorney in our head starts doubting him or herself. The prosecution attorney makes an argument and then goes, hold on a minute, that's not the argument, that's not the right answer. It may not actually be involving a defense attorney at all. In this circumstance, I would counsel, from a totally unjustified and unqualified position, I would counsel that the defense attorney needs to step in and say, actually, your doubts are for a very good reason, and maybe they're instinct based, and maybe in fact they're experience based, and you actually have a good reason to have those doubts. And the prosecutor goes, no, actually, I believe that my doubts are wrong. I know actually maybe they're right, but no, maybe they're wrong. And actually, what right do I have to have these doubts? And the defense attorney says, you are enough. You are enough. Your doubts are enough. You are allowed your opinion, because underlying this, the doubts aren't actually the problem. The problem is whether or not we are aware enough of ourselves to know ourselves, and whether we are the truest version of ourselves. And maybe in this court of that person, maybe their court needs the defense attorney to actually stand up to defend their truest self. Anyway, Martin, back to your point. Sorry, Prashant. Martin, back to your point on this. I have a question for you. When you have a stimulus or an experience happens, how conscious are you of how you think?
Different levels on different days, but it's and it does depend on what I'm being sort of what the stimulus is or who it's from. Can have a bearing on that as well. But I'm getting more conscious, and I think to be able to play with those doubts and or that kind of antithesis point of view is a real it's a real brave thing to do. It's seeing that fear and tackling it. Or allowing it to enter into the space of your thoughts. I think that's quite a courageous element to thought that we don't generally allow in ourselves, and I'm starting to see more and more of that as I'm going along. I'm actually just reading a really good book on this kind of thing at the moment, called The Courage to Create by Rollo May. And so that's got a lot of these kind of threads in it as well, about the bravery of thoughts. And
there's another book as well that you'll find interesting then, called The Surrender Experiment, just so you know.
I will make a note of that.
Yeah, along the same path.
Excellent. Yeah. So I'm looking at these different areas and trying to find the courage to tackle those sides of my thoughts, and just recognizing when they come along as well, so that I don't take that shortcut path to something. And so a lot of that's been based on the stuff that Daniel Goleman wrote in his emotional intelligence book, and even the kind of work on nonviolent communication that I've been reading up on as well. kind of starts to all feed into this and almost homogenize into one kind of one program, really.
Yeah. Prashant, what's your view?
I just had a thought. Is this maybe one of the culprits in all of this really is language, because language is the medium through which other voices enter our heads, our own voice, and language is the thing through which is what actually grounds us, but actually stops us from growing wings as well, and seeing things. So is it possible to actually get your mind to a state of non-linguistic thinking?
Yes, and I think that is a good ambition, and I wonder whether or not language is predominantly for communication. That sounds almost too basic. Were it not for our need to communicate, sorry, actually no, that's not true either. One view could be, were it not for our need to communicate, language would be irrelevant. But actually, language isn't needed in music when we can communicate through various different media. But then one could argue there as well. Here's the defence and prosecution that that music is a language. So and music is seemingly far less limited than the 70,000 words that we have in the English language, let's say. And funnily enough, of course, if you look at the real life hacks, you can learn to speak conversational Spanish or French, for instance, using about 200 to 300, maybe 400 words. So, but my interpretation of how we think is less based on. I don't think of things in a particular language. I think of things it looks more like a painting. And in fact, using the term defense and prosecution attorney, I must admit, even when I videoed that, I have to forgive myself that I'm simplifying something that is more like a mosaic than it is some form of binary tile color. I'm saying that there's a blue tile and a red tile, and they go and they argue against each other. The truth is, it's probably a mosaic. And it's more likely, like your metaphor of there's monkeys on the ceiling throwing stuff, and there's the jury, arguing amongst each other, and there's a judge that turned up drunk, and then there's people shouting from that's probably more like what it is.
Yeah.
I accept that.
I like that image, actually.
Like a Hieronymus Bosch painting.
Yes, it's more like it's more Jackson Pollock than.
Fair enough. Yeah, I'm gonna get that abstract with
it. Could be like Bruegel's also, Peter Bruegel.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. Yeah. But then I think we can also forgive ourselves for the chaos, because without being too cliched about it, the order in chaos comes from my view anyway, my observation of how chaos is organized. Is that the order comes from the learning from the chaos, rather than trying to organize the chaos into bite-sized linear chunks. The feature and the flaw of chaos is that it is not linear nor predictable, but the opportunity inside chaos is the learning from how that chaotic disorder actually provides us with insight. And I'm okay with that. I think we can forgive ourselves as well with that.
I think that would be a mistake with looking at chaos to try and break it down into bite-sized chunks anyway, because if you take bigger and bigger and bigger samples, you often start to find more patterns.
Yeah, totally right. And in fact, I think that's kind of what I mean by the learning. The opportunity of chaos is the understanding out of it. And yeah, in fact, there is a strong argument to say that what you need is more chaos. And actually, here's a loop right here. I was waiting for the loop. Back to Prashant's point about having the monkeys throwing things from the ceiling and the order of things. The disorder of things. Maybe it's actually a feature of the court that there isn't just a defense and prosecution attorney. Maybe in fact simplifying this down doesn't do it justice, because we need to increase the sample size. We need more monkeys on the ceiling. We need more jurors arguing. and we need more drunk judges so that we can expand out our sample size to find the real patterns. Yeah. Okay. I buy that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for example, if you just, let's say you're out on a night drinking and you end up getting attracted to someone, how many things are probably, how many voices are probably calling out in your head? That would be an interesting thing to analyze at that particular moment when something like that happens.
Yeah, and actually this is an interesting point, because one of the things from a chemical perspective, because alcohol is a depressant, if you think about what it actually depresses, the mental imagery scans of people who are under the influence of alcohol shows that the answer is not a great deal of processing, and that's what alcohol does. It gives us the impression that we have never been more certain about something, but from a neurological perspective, we are nowhere near any form of reason or certainty due to the impact of alcohol on our thinking. Whereas here's another example. Let's say that you just eat plant-based food for several days, and zero alcohol, no form of intoxicants that are artificially put inside us by ourselves. We sleep for exactly the right amount of time that our body needs, and spend a significant amount of time in silence and reflection and meditating, and then you monitor what happens in your brain when you're thinking. And paradoxically, the slowing down and simplification of thoughts is also shown, but not from a depression that's come from alcohol, but has come from a calmness that has come from detoxification.
Yeah,
so it's kind of like a U-curve of calm. One is due to toxification, and the other is due to detoxification. And in the middle bit here, where we mostly live as reasonable people who aren't Zen monks and who aren't absolute raging drunkards, is we just have this cluster of stuff. And it's one of the reasons why I think the consumerization, to your point, Prashant, and to your very understandable snobbery on, we get confused by so many things and the chaotic nature of our life that we try to medicate ourselves in a way that makes us not think so much about the consumerization. Paradoxically, still, how we try and medicate ourselves is to become consumers. We go to an off license and buy alcohol, or we buy loads of food from a supermarket and we try and eat ourselves into comfort, and we watch TV through a subscription service inside a flat that we're paying rent on a road which contains our car which we bought. So ironically, we consumerize ourselves out of the feeling of consumerization, which is the beauty of consumerization. Actually, if you were to build it as a business model, it's genius, as is religion.
Wow, it is. It's when you reach that state of calm, does that mean that both the attorneys vanish completely, or do they morph into a harmonious whole?
I think they agree. Could you imagine a court case where the defense and the prosecution attorney both win?
Yeah. Wow.
That's what a synthesis is, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's finding that point where everybody's happy.
Yeah, it would be a win-win. And I mean, this is intentionally ideological saying this, but I have experienced that win-win from the defense and the prosecution, where I can actually see things from either end of a very wide spectrum. And say, actually, this suffices everyone's objective. Everyone on the prosecution and the defense goes tick, 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 tick. They shake hands. And that's, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi would call that flow, being in flow. And so that flow state, I think, is probably where the defense and prosecution have rested. Yeah. Okay. Well, in summary then, Martin, closing comments from you, Mr. Gordon.
I hadn't really considered Prashant's idea of there being more than two voices in there, but I quite like the idea that there are more and more voices and lots of chaos involved, because at times our thoughts can seem extremely chaotic for a moment. But what I really like is I'm still coming back to that idea of the angel and the devil on your shoulders that you used to find in comic books and Abbott Costello movies or whatever it would be. So yeah, I think I've kind of got lots more to think about on this, to be honest. But I'm liking the idea of it.
Good.
As a kind of metaphor for how our thoughts work, it's a great model, really.
It is, and I too also echo that in terms of the other characters inside the courtroom. I'm going to expand more on that in my thinking. That's what I'm going to delve deeper into that and see if I can widen the metaphor. Or whether the metaphor needs to be widened. Whether in fact the characters in the court are channeled through the prosecution and the defence.
Well, think of it as sort of a noisy kangaroo court.
Yes, yeah, that's probably more accurate for you, right?
Yeah.
Okay, Prashant, in closing, what's your is that your summary comment? That could be your summary comment, actually.
Well, that could be, yeah.
Let's call it that.
Yeah.
Did you have anything else to add? I want to give you the space to add if you do wish.
No, I think this has been a very insightful talk, and I think I've said everything I wanted to.
Good. That's the objective.
Yeah.
Good. I'm happy with that. Good. In which case, thanks, guys. I shall see you next time, and I really appreciate your candor and for helping me expand my thinking as well, which is, that's my evolution can only come from that.
A lot of today's insights will could be used in the next talk on statistics as knowledge.
Yeah, let's carry them through. Let's carry them through to the next one. Okay. Thanks, guys. I shall speak to you soon.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Cheers, both.